Hello there. Welcome to Planet America's Weekend Edition. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chester Chidello.
This week, Trump declares the peace process in Ukraine is underway as the culture war sees name changes getting kind of silly.
And we get a legal opinion on Trump's executive orders and how the courts can slow his roll. But first,
President Trump spoke to his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin this week for what's understood to be the first time since his return to the Oval Office. And Trump declared the Ukraine peace process is now underway. But then, in an interview with Fox News, Trump also said something that set off a few alarm bells in Kyiv and indeed around the world.
They have tremendously valuable land in terms of rare earth, in terms of oil and gas, in terms of other things. I want to have our money secured because we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars. And, you know, they may make a deal, they may not make a deal, they may be Russian someday or they may not be Russian someday, but we're going to have all this money in there, and I say I want it back.
Only start to a peace process. Ukraine may be Russian someday. Certainly a far cry from President Biden's vow not to walk away from Ukraine. The comment drew this response as well from another blast from the past, Trump's former Vice President Mike Pence, who posted, "Mr. President, Ukraine will only be Russian someday if the United States abandons them to Putin's brutal invasion. If Ukraine falls, it will only be a matter of time until Russia invades a NATO ally. Our troops will also be required to defend." Trump's current Vice President, J.D. Vance, meanwhile, is meeting with the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, at this week's Munich Security Conference. Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth also in Europe this week. He had a blunt message at a meeting of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group. He said that the United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement and that a return to Ukraine's 2014 borders, including lost territory in the east and Crimea, is also, quote, not realistic. Well, former National Security Advisor John Bolton is now accusing Trump and his team of handing victory to Russia.
President Trump has effectively surrendered to Putin before the negotiations have even begun. The positions that Defense Secretary Hegseth announced in Brussels, which I'm sure I'd be stunned if Trump didn't convey them directly to Putin in their phone call, constitute terms of a settlement that could have been written in the Kremlin. Maybe they were written in the Kremlin.
Fascinating dig, that one. No love lost, of course, these days between Bolton and Trump. But for Bolton to basically accuse Trump of not just giving up on Ukraine, but maybe doing the Kremlin's bidding, is pretty extraordinary.
yeah, look, I mean, I think that what Hegseth said about the fact they're not going to go back to the original borders of Ukraine, I think that's probably logical.
Yeah, quite realistic.
But for them to just concede NATO, which was Russia's biggest issue, before they even start negotiation, that was a big concession.
Yeah. I mean, the two are connected in the sense that if Ukraine is still wanting to go back to its earlier borders, then if they become a NATO state, they are an invaded NATO state, and then suddenly, boom, it's World War III.
Yeah.
So one does prevent the other.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but I also understand why Bolton's going, why are you giving that up before we even begin negotiations?
It's a weird tactic saying, look, you take this and we'll start talking.
Yeah, it makes me wonder whether the fix is in, whether the deal has already been done behind the scenes, in principle, between Putin and Trump, and they're just play acting in.
Well, at the moment, they're saying, sorry, Zelensky, you're not actually invited to this conversation, and Trump wants to sort it out directly with Putin and maybe with Xi Jinping.
Which, once again, is what Putin wants. The whole time it's been Putin saying, we negotiate, America and Russia, Ukraine stays out of it.
Ukraine's not really a thing.
Yeah, so that's another thing that would be annoying Bolton. Having said that, Trump has been a lot harsher on Russia recently than he had in the past. I'm talking about the last probably month. And they certainly, they've set up a situation where there is, well, supporters of Ukraine have set up a situation where Trump has the appropriate incentive to care about Ukraine. Let's put it that way. He's got a deal in the works. A few days ago, Trump expressed a desire to do a deal with Ukraine where America would secure what they're giving Ukraine with Ukraine's rare earth minerals, which Ukraine, by the way, has plenty of. We're talking 5% of the world's mineral supply in Ukraine. And the best part is those minerals are located right on the east of Ukraine. So if Trump doesn't help Ukraine out, those rare earth minerals will be the first to fall under Putin's control, which Trump won't like. And of course, as soon as Trump asked, Zelensky immediately obliged with, if we're talking about a deal, then let's do a deal. We're only for it. Good move for Zelensky. By the way, credit where it's due. That idea came straight from US politics' very own Littlefinger, Lindsey Graham, who, back in May 2024, he helpfully suggested Ukraine has a lot of critical minerals, you know, trillions potentially, and if they become a robust economy, they can pass that back. Lindsey knows how to press Trump's buttons, and if Trump does eventually come through for Ukraine, it may well be Lindsey Graham's doing.
Yeah, pity for Ukraine that they don't have some nice waterfront property there with some nice warm water lapping against it. That'd be a cinch.
Then they'll become America.
Yeah, right, exactly. Look, among the hundreds of executive orders that have been flying from the Trump White House, one of them headed the Iron Dome for America. It calls for the deployment and maintenance of a next-generation missile defence shield with space-based interceptors and the capability to defeat missile attacks prior to launch. Now, this isn't a new pledge. During last year's presidential campaign, Trump often talked about developing a system based on Israel's Iron Dome defence system, which has clearly impressed him.
It's so incredible. And these guys, these geniuses, they go, these are not muscle guys here, they're muscle guys up here, right? And they calmly walk to a seat, ding, 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 ding. They've only got 17 seconds to figure this whole thing out, right? Boom. Okay. Missile launch, pshing, boom. It's the most and we don't have it here, but we help other countries in having it. No, we're going to have the greatest Iron Dome, let's call it Iron Dome, anywhere in the world, and it's going to be manufactured, a lot of it, right here in New Hampshire, actually.
In fact, Trump loved the idea of bing, 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 boom.
Whiz.
So much that he made it number 8 on his 20-point list of his policy platform for the 2024 election.
Yeah, well, I guess in a sense, missile defence came to be another way that Trump, in that campaign, was offering the American people a sense of greater safety. A little bit like that pledge in 2016 to build a border wall to stop illegal immigration, including rapists and terrorists coming into America. But, according to our next guest, there's only one catch. It simply won't work. It is not possible to defend America from missile attack with a form of the Iron Dome system. Joe Cirincione is a leading national security analyst, long-time US government advisor, member of the National Foreign Relations Council, the past president as well of the Anti-Nuclear Proliferation Ploughshares Fund. Joe Cirincione, welcome to Planet America.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So tell us, Joe, why in your view would an American version of Iron Dome not work?
It's completely implausible. First of all, Iron Dome is designed for short-range rockets, projectiles that travel, 40, 60, maybe 100 kilometers. It has no capability whatsoever against longer-range missiles. And so to try to duplicate that, to try to say, as President Trump has done, that Israel has shown the technology works, what we need is to have it over here, is ludicrous. The Iron Dome defensive system defends about 45 square kilometers of space. You would need tens of thousands of Iron Dome systems at about $100 million a piece to defend the continental United States. I tallied it up. It would cost about $2.5 trillion to try to do it that way, if it worked at all. But of course, it doesn't. So it just makes no sense. And nor does it make sense to try to bring in other systems that are designed for short-range or medium-range missiles that do have some effectiveness. I mean, we've all seen what happened during the Gaza war. We've all seen the ability of Israel to shoot down ballistic missiles. But again, these are short-range ballistic missiles, and they're using Patriot. They're using American destroyers with the Aegis system. They're using some THAAD systems, again, designed for short to medium-range missiles. They have no capability against intercontinental ballistic missiles that span the ocean and come in many times faster and are much more difficult to hit than any of the systems that Israel has encountered.
But if America can't have an Iron Dome, then how does America protect itself against Chinese and Russian missiles?
Well, it doesn't, and it's not for lack of effort. Remember, it was 1983 when Ronald Reagan originally introduced the Strategic Defense Initiative, what became known as Star Wars. And the idea, as he said, was to build a shield that would defend America from missiles the way a roof defends a family from rain. And we tried to do this. Since Reagan's announcement, we have spent $415 billion on missile systems, missile interceptors of all kinds. None of them have worked against intercontinental ballistic missiles. We've had the best corporations, the brightest scientific minds. We've had support for 22 years of Republicans who were in control of the program, 20 years where Democrats were in control of the program. We tried everything. The result, 42 years later, what we have is about 40 interceptors in Alaska and 4 in California that can perhaps shoot down 1 or 2 ballistic missiles if North Korea, for example, should try to launch against us. But that's it. That's the capability. And in tests, these missiles work about half the time under ideal conditions, but they can't deal with multiple launches. They can't deal with decoys, jammers, any effort that the enemy would have to try to thwart the system. And it's not for lack of trying. We have tried. You simply cannot build an effective national ballistic missile defense system. It's not a question of political will. It's a question of science.
Okay, but just because something is not technologically possible now doesn't mean that it will remain impossible. In 1962, when John F. Kennedy said we will send a man to the moon by the end of the decade, it was not possible. By the end of the decade, it was possible. So how is this different?
And that's why it's worth researching this. Now, even though the interceptors that we're using right now, these are ground-based rockets that fire off into space and try to hit the ballistic missile as it comes in, even though those have proved inadequate, someday it might be possible to have directed energy weapons, lasers, for example, that could travel at the speed of light, that can even be based in space and do this. That's expensive, that's difficult, we can't do it now, but it's worth researching that kind of effort to see if it could do. So we spend about $30 billion a year on ballistic missile defense systems. It's an enormous amount of money. Keep researching it, but that is not what the president's executive order says. It says to design an architecture within 6 months that could develop and then deploy these systems. He wants to get going immediately. This is a complete fantasy. There is no system. There is no system of systems. There is no concept of a system that could possibly work anytime in the near future. We will be dead and buried before we get anywhere close to an effective missile defense system, if we ever do.
So, Joe, is this just one of those situations where the president's going to go, let's get this happening now, but in reality, it's just 4 more years of research and that's fine?
Right. This effort is primarily to sort of pump up his right-wing base. The main proponents of this idea are the Project 2025 authors, the Heritage Foundation. It's no coincidence that they were behind Ronald Reagan's original plan back in 1983. Same foundation, same concept, that we shouldn't be dependent on a retaliatory strike to deter an enemy from attacking us. We should use our scientific and military power to build a shield. We tried, we failed. It doesn't exist. But for some, the faithful, is more of a cult than a scientific pursuit. They believe that this is essential. And for others, it's just a source of income. I mean, $30 billion a year is a lot of money. If this executive order increases that, as the Project 2025 authors want to do, to something like 40, 50, $100 billion a year, that's a lot of money. Defense contractors, large corporations will make a lot of money getting contracts under this program, whether it works or not.
What about, though, Iron Dome type defence against non-nuclear threats? We have seen in Ukraine and elsewhere in recent times drones emerging as a major threat to civilian populations. Could they have an application there? In
the United States? No. In the theater, like if you're in the Mediterranean, in Israel and Gaza, where you're dealing with short-range threats, yes, these systems work. We can do this. We can shoot a bullet with a bullet, whether it's a cruise missile or a hypervelocity a reentry vehicle or a short or medium range ballistic missile, we can do that a fair amount of the time. The problem comes when you're dealing with long range systems that in space can deploy decoys or very small, targets traveling very fast. Can't do that. And cruise missiles are an even worse problem. If you're battling another ship, you see that ship, you can see when they're launching the cruise missile towards you, that's one thing. But if you're trying to defend the continental United States, which has thousands of miles of coastline, that means you basically have to put up a picket line of either land-based or sea-based defenses that can shoot down these cruise missiles within 30, 40 miles of range. That's an enormously expensive undertaking. Even if you were just to do it around the major ports, again, hugely expensive, very difficult. And whenever you try to do something like that, the enemy has a say in this. And they can develop countermeasures that can defeat your system. They can go around it. They can go under it. They can sabotage it. It's a fool's game. Missile defense on a national level is a fool's game. You cannot win this. It's idiotic to pursue this, even if it satisfies your political base.
So, Joe, what makes long-range ballistic missiles so much harder to intercept? Is it just the speed of them, their height? What in particular?
So a ballistic missile is like throwing a ball in an arc. It has a brief period of powered flight, and then it goes into outer space where it follows a ballistic trajectory. It's like throwing a ball from home plate into the outfield. And it is during that mid-course phase, when it's in outer space, that it becomes very difficult to hit. That's what these interceptors try to do. They try to meet the warhead, which is no longer a very big, fat, hot missile with an engine burning. It's a cold, small warhead about the size of a human being. And you're trying to hit this from thousands of miles away with your own interceptor rocket. That's hard enough to do. Remarkably, in the 42 years since Ronald Reagan's SDI initiative, we've been able to do that in tests about 50% of the time. Remarkable achievement, but it requires a cooperative target. It requires a target that you know its dimensions, you know its trajectory. In our test, we even put a little transponder on it that beams out, here I am, and our interceptor follows that beam to the target. But in the real world, that target is going to be maybe maneuvering, changing course, so you can't plot a good trajectory. It could be deploying chaff. It could be deploying jammers. It could be deploying decoys, light balloons that look exactly like the warhead. And in there's no atmosphere in outer space, so balloons will look and act exactly like a much heavier warhead. So instead of one target, now you have dozens of targets, which is the real one. You could even put the warhead inside a balloon. How do I know this? Because that's the kind of countermeasures we develop. The United States has these countermeasures. The CIA, the intelligence agencies, assess that any country that can develop a long-range ballistic missile can develop a good dozen different kinds of countermeasures. That's what makes it so hard to do this mission, which is why the SDI program originally abandoned any kind of ground-based system. And the idea was we were going to put lasers in space that could zap all of these, that could do not one warhead, but could do dozens of them with little laser beams. Well, that proved to be completely unfeasible. Back in 1987, a definitive study from the American Physical Society said it would take decades of research before we would know if this was feasible. It's been almost 40 years. We still don't believe this is feasible. It's just too complicated. It requires too much power, too much cost to get all the stuff into space, too much cost and difficulty in maintaining a constellation that would have to stay functioning in space for years, tens of years, too complicated to have a computer control system that can manage this. And then get this system has to work perfectly the first and only time it's ever going to be used. It's just beyond our technical capabilities.
Joe Cirincione, thank you very much indeed for being with us on Planet America.
My pleasure. Thank you.
President Trump's flight down to New Orleans for this week's Super Bowl took a slight detour over the newly proclaimed Gulf of America, previously and still known to the rest of the world as the Gulf of Mexico. He even declared February the 9th Gulf of America Day.
So we thought this would be appropriate. Even bigger than the Super Bowl. This is a big thing. And almost everybody now has assented to that.
Attention on board. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please direct your attention out the right side of the aircraft. Air Force One is currently in international waters for the first time in history, flying over the recently renamed Gulf of America.
Well, the pilot was half right there when he said international waters, because Trump doesn't have any power to rename the Gulf in the eyes of the world. He did order the US Board on Geographic Names to do so, and producers of maps like Google will show users in the United States the Gulf of America name. Mexicans will keep seeing Gulf of Mexico on their Google Maps, while the rest of the world will see Mexico first with America in parentheses. But that creates a bit of a problem for international news agencies like the Associated Press, which has taken the decision to keep calling it the Gulf of Mexico because they say it has carried this name for 400 years, while also acknowledging the new name that Trump has chosen. Not good enough for the Trump White House, which retaliated this week by barring an Associated Press reporter from the Oval Office during a signing ceremony of more executive orders. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt then explained their decision this way.
There are lies being pushed by outlets in this room. We are going to hold those lies accountable. And it is a fact that the body of water off the coast of Louisiana is called the Gulf of America. And I'm not sure why news outlets don't want to call it that, but that is what it is. The Secretary of Interior has made that the official designation in the geographical identification name server, and Apple has recognized that, Google has recognized that, pretty much every other outlet in this room has recognized that body of water as the Gulf of America, and it's very important to this administration that we get that right, not just for people here at home, but also for the rest of the world.
That there is idiotic.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, she's talking about lies.
Yeah.
Like the,
Accusing the media of lying by having editorial policies that recognise what something is internationally known for and has been for 400 years.
Well, I was going to say, the AP is not reporting for America, it's reporting for the entire world. Yeah. And the fact is, if you want to talk about lies, that the Gulf of America is only called the Gulf of America in America. And so it just doesn't make any sense to say, like if we're talking the actual name, like she wants to be technical, the actual name is the Gulf of Mexico everywhere but in America, which is most of where the AP...
I don't know when I see that whether it's just complete twaddle or is it actually some scary Orwellian stuff. And maybe it's both at once. I'm not sure anymore.
I think I lean towards twaddle. I also, look, if Trump wants to push this hard, why didn't he make a public holiday? What's the point of having a day that isn't even a holiday? Like,
already on Super Bowl Sunday.
Yeah, it's just cheap. Anyway, he does love it. There's no doubt about that. He loves his Gulf of America. I've got some footage for you here. This is from like 4 days later.
Right.
That map is still just hanging round the Oval Office while he's welcoming Tulsi Gabbard to the cabinet. He's just still got the map just sitting there next to his desk. Wow. He loves the Gulf of America so much. Unfortunately for Trump, he's the only one. Reuters have done a poll on this, and this is very close to the least popular thing Trump has done so far in this term. 70% of people oppose renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. So I'm not sure it's going to catch on. It's only going to last 4 years. Maybe the next Republican president, if they win the election, might keep it. But I'm not even sure even they will. I think it's just Trump who likes it.
I'm surprised it's not more popular than that. But there you
I'm
go.
not.
Well, speaking of renaming things, we talked on Wednesday night's show about Trump's reversion to the name Mount McKinley instead of Denali for the nation's highest peak up in Alaska. That is to honour an all but forgotten tariff-imposing President William McKinley, instead of respecting the name that native Alaskans have used literally for millennia. And now the history and culture war is becoming truly absurd. The US military base that was currently known as Fort Liberty, but just for the last 2 years, has been renamed Fort Bragg again.
I direct the Army to change the name of Fort Liberty, North Carolina to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. That's right, Bragg is back.
But here's the twist. The North Carolina base that was named in the 1920s after a Confederate general, Braxton Bragg, who fought to succeed from the United States and to preserve slavery during the Civil War, has been renamed Fort Bragg, but this time it is to honour somebody else, Paratrooper Roland L. Bragg, who the Defence Department this week described as a World War II hero who earned the Silver Star and Purple Heart for his exceptional courage during the Battle of the Bulge. Pete Hegseth says that finding a way to call it Fort Bragg again is about restoring the legacy of the service members who trained and served there over its 100-year history. Now, Chaz, finding a way to call it Fort Bragg again, but after a different brag, does that make it less racist and ridiculous? More ridiculous, less racist?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly it feels like a troll. It feels like a troll to go, we went.
It's a different brag.
It's a different brag.
We're renaming Pennsylvania Avenue Hitler Parade, but it's a different Hitler, Frank Hitler, who was a hero in the First World War.
And I get what he's saying about people serving, feeling some connection to the name that they served in, nostalgia. I get that, but I thought the whole point of all this offence at the changing of names of the Confederate generals at the bases and the statues and all stuff was about defiling history. I thought the argument back in 2020 when all this stuff happened was, we're getting rid of history for political correctness. We're not celebrating Confederates, but what we're doing is we're celebrating America's rich tapestry of history. That's what we're doing. They've just gotten rid of the history.
Yeah.
Like they've kept the name, which is not the important bit. The history's meant to be the important bit, and they've just gotten rid of the history.
Yeah, and it's not as though Roland L. Bragg, even though he did heroic things, he stole a German ambulance and drove 4 of his wounded comrades to a hospital to get help. Apparently, the German allowed him to take the ambulance because they're both Freemasons, and Bragg bopped him on the head, and he took the ambulance. Great, but he's not a household name. It's not a well-known story. Basically, somebody in the Defence Department just went through and said, let's find a Bragg who did something heroic and we'll rename it after him. It is so tacky and cynical.
Yeah.
It really is. And, you know, even Bragg's family said, well, he would have been surprised. He came back to civilian life, never talked about this. He was a truck driver in private life, died in 1999. Good guy, but not a hero, not a national figure.
To be honest, this is, I mean, I think the whole thing, I agree the whole thing's a bit tacky, but this is partly the result, I think, of it being renamed in a poor way. Like Fort Liberty, that's lame.
I don't know. That's the kind of thing Trump would have called it.
Yeah, so like,
I'm surprised he didn't keep it.
It is a bit lame calling it Fort Liberty. What they should have done, if they called it after another hero, right? Like someone who is big enough to have a fort named after them, then it would have been a lot harder to dename it from that person.
Right.
Because there would have been an insult to that person.
Yeah.
But to dename Fort Liberty, who cares?
Sure.
So I feel like the poor naming off Bragg to become Liberty was set them up for this. But anyway, it is. Look, I will say this about Pete Hegseth. Like this naming stuff, it's not hurting anyone. Whether you call it Bragg or Roland Bragg or whatever, no one's dying because of the name of the fort. But it does get quite silly, this renaming stuff.
But still finding a way of, backdoor honouring a traitor and a racist, which is what Braxton Bragg was.
Yeah.
And it was a part of a 1920s Lost Cause movement, which was all about celebrating racists and traitors for very current political reasons then. They're trying to do the same thing now.
Well, yeah, look, I'm not arguing about the Bragg thing. I'm actually just segueing to the next thing, John.
Sorry, I missed the segue.
That's okay. It does get a bit silly, though, because this week in Congress, the renaming thing, they just took it to a whole new level, which was someone, I think, desperately trying to suck up, I don't know to who, to the rainbow, maybe, to rename Greenland when Trump acquired it to be called Red, White and Blue Land. Yes, that's right. That's not a joke. That's not a satire. That's not the South Park people making fun of the Republican House. Yeah. Someone seriously has suggested, they put it in a bill, to rename Greenland Red, White and Blue Land. I feel like this is the time I want to get off the ride.
Well, as long as they rename Fort Bragg Fort Greenland, I've got no trouble with that at all. After the first few weeks of frantic executive actions coming from the new Trump White House and a Department of Government Efficiency DOGE purge of agencies like USAID, the courts have been increasingly weighing in the last week or so. In some cases, putting temporary halts to layoffs and funding freezes. In other cases, this week, week, allowing the sweeping fork in the road resignation process to go ahead after earlier pauses in that. There are concerns, though, that a standoff could emerge between the different branches of government if Trump, as the executive, for example, defies the judicial branch and ignores court orders, and whether Congress, which of course is dominated by Trump's fellow Republicans, will even want to exercise their traditional power of the purse strings and maybe refuse to defund certain programs that are slated by the White House or Doge for destruction. Well, for more on all of this, we're joined by Kate Shaw. She's an expert in constitutional law and executive powers who worked in the Obama White House counsel's office and is co-host now of the Strict Scrutiny legal podcast. Kate Shaw, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
So we're hearing, Kate, the phrase constitutional crisis being bandied about by both sides this week. Does what you are seeing amount yet to a constitutional crisis?
I do think we are already in a constitutional crisis. I think that when one branch of government asserts and wields powers that far exceed the scope of their powers as they have long been understood, and where the other branches do not meaningfully push back on those assertions of power, I do think that that's a constitutional crisis. But I do want to add, I'm not in any way suggesting we have passed the point of no return. There are lots of responses and mechanisms for pushback that are still available, some of which are being used. But I do think we've entered constitutional crisis territory.
Kate, there's a trick that Trump's been pulling a lot, where he sacks in a fairly dubious fashion people on oversight boards. So many they can't even reach quorum, and therefore he sabotages the oversight board from providing oversight, even though that's what Congress intended. So how is that not against the law?
I think that's right. That is very much the pattern we have seen. The National Labor Relations Board, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Those are bodies that, Trump has fired members of, and those firings have deprived the bodies of a quorum, which means they are functionally going to be unable to perform many of their duties, exactly as you said, as Congress charged them with doing. So there's, in some ways, kind of a double illegality. The firings themselves are, in some instances, I think, plainly illegal. The Supreme Court might ultimately decide to change the law and make them legal, but right now they are illegal. And then there's the secondary illegality, which is essentially thwarting the ability of these bodies to function in a meaningful way to enforce the laws protecting workers, among other things. And so I think that is the pattern. I do think that at the end of the day, at least some of these firings will be deemed unlawful, certainly by the lower courts. The big question is what the Supreme Court will do when it gets some of these cases.
You talk there, Kate, about potential points of no return. President Trump has said he will abide by any court rulings and appeal the ones he doesn't agree with, whereas Elon Musk and JD Vance have kind of said we'll potentially impeach any judge who issues a judgment that we don't like. Is that the red line? Is that the point of no return to you?
I think those are escalations, but I also don't think those take us past the point of no return. I'm trying not to take too seriously some of what the likes of JD Vance are saying on social media. I think that more important, so one, you referenced that Trump himself, at least right now, has said that he intends to abide by the rulings of courts and to challenge them on appeal, but not by outright defiance. That I think is important. And in some ways, even more important is what is happening inside agencies and inside the federal courts, where we have over 36 lawsuits that have already been filed and are proceeding. And at least so far, the Justice Department lawyers who represent the administration are telling the courts they are complying with court orders. Now, compliance has been far from perfect. And one of the cases, the one in Rhode Island regarding that OMB spending freeze from the very beginning of the administration, seems as though the judge has found not just failure to fully comply because of some, failed communications or something like that, but something close to non-compliance, at least as to some aspects of the order. The order, charged OMB, the budget office, with putting spending back on after they had put a pause in place, but not all of the spigots have been turned back on, and the district court judge is very concerned about that. But I do think that politicians will say a lot, in particular on social media, and more important is what they do. And right now, at least, they are largely in compliance with court orders.
As you say, there are 36 cases moving through the US courts at the moment. There's probably going to be more soon. Is there any sense that some of those cases might move faster than others, or Are we going to have to wait 12 to 18 months for any of these questions to be finally resolved?
No, I think that some of them will move much faster than that. So as a general matter, look, the Supreme Court has enormous control over the timing of the cases that it hears and decides. I have been very critical of the court in terms of how it's made those timing decisions, in particular last year when the court slow-walked its consideration of whether Trump was immune from criminal prosecution because he was an ex-president at that point. But the court also can move quickly and has on many occasions, and in particular where the party appealing is the federal government, and the party appealing is asking the court to essentially reverse a lower court ruling that stops the federal government from doing something the federal government claims it has a legal right to do. The justices often will accelerate consideration on the view that, well, a court order disabling the function of government, even if what government is trying to do is ultimately deemed illegal, but that's a court order that should be reviewed expeditiously. So I certainly think we're talking a matter of months. I expect that the first of these cases would likely end up before the Supreme Court within the next couple of months, certainly not a year or more.
And I wonder what you make of Trump's sort of flood the zone approach to dozens and dozens of executive orders, some of which seem to have been rather hastily drafted. They haven't gone through line by line to check the legal implications of every word. Is it very different to the way your team approached it in the Obama White House?
Very different. Look, I think every administration that has ambitions, whatever those ambitions are, wants to hit the ground running and do a lot very quickly, assuming that kind of the wind is at your back and the public is going to be supportive of a new administration that's just come to power. So the volume itself, I don't think, is inherently troubling, but certainly the flagrant illegality, frankly, of much of it is extraordinarily troubling. Much of the conduct is in clear violation of statutes passed by Congress. And there is a theory that underlies many of the moves, which is that the statutes passed by Congress, where they constrain presidential power, are unconstitutional. And so they don't need to be obeyed, those statutes. Previous presidents, Donald Trump is not the first one, have pushed the boundaries where they thought the law as written was wrong and they wanted the courts to change the law. And that in and of itself is something that is not inherently problematic, but there are ways to do it respecting the system, and there are ways to do it that feel contemptuous, like profoundly contemptuous of the system, of the other branches of government, and of the Constitution itself. And the course of conduct we have seen since inauguration, I think, is very much in the latter category.
Kate, is there any way that Trump can disappear an entire agency legally without a congressional vote? And I'm thinking in particular about the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau here, where they're effectively trying to disappear the agency by zeroing out its budget.
In a word, no. The president does not have unilateral authority to end an agency. Congress creates agencies, and Congress has the authority, if it wants, to reshape agencies, to change their authorities, or even if it wants to eliminate agencies. That's absolutely something Congress has the power to do, but the president does not have that power unilaterally. And, one thing to add here is the president's party does control Congress, both houses of Congress. So if the president wanted to just eliminate federal agencies, there is a lawful process by which to do that. And I think it is telling that he has not even tried that route, instead has tried just to do this in a unilaterally and frankly lawless way.
Kate Shaw, thank you for joining us on Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
So, with all of that going on, what do American voters make of Donald Trump's first few weeks back in the White House? The polls, you have to say, are quite interesting. Trump started with a 47% approval rating, and that's only slightly better than when he started his first term in 2017. Both of those numbers were lower than any other newly elected president dating back to 1953, when those sorts of polls began. Trump is still the only president to start at below 50%. And in his first term, Trump never topped 50% approval in the Gallup poll. Well, look at this. According to CBS YouGov, 53% of US adults approve of Trump's overall job performance so far in office, with most describing him as tough, energetic, focused and effective, and as doing what he promised to do during his campaign. That will come as good news for the White House.
Absolutely. And when you're talking about the Gallup poll at the beginning, yes, it was, as you say, 47% approval, which is a lot less than Biden's, which was 58% in his first week.
Yep. Biden finished at about 39-40% at the end of his term.
Exactly. But the Gallup was, in all the polls over the last few weeks, has been on the low side. Like there have been a few higher polls, as you say.
Several getting into the low 50s.
Absolutely, which, as you say, Trump never had that in his first term. According to 538, the average of the polls is currently 49%. It's dropped maybe half a point since Trump took over, which is very solid, like by Trump standards. That's doing fine. I want to focus on a CBS poll, though. And the reason why I want to focus on it is because it's the highest of the respectable polls at 53%. I think there's a lesson or two we can learn from that. So I just want to look in more detail. It was particularly positive, the CBS poll, about Trump's immigration policy, which is something that many pundits thought might be a drag on Trump's numbers by this point.
The idea of deporting those in the country illegally continues to be popular. We saw that in the campaign. Sending troops to the U.S.-Mexico border, again, majority in favor. We'd seen that in the campaign.
64% are approving of sending the troops to the border. That is a huge change. I remember when that was in the 30s, sending troops to the border. People's minds on immigration have completely changed over the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I guess a lot of fear-mongering, a lot of talk of criminal immigrants and mental patients and all this kind of stuff. Suddenly, drastic military action seems like a good idea.
Well, whether it's rhetoric or whether it's a response to Biden's policies, whatever it is, they have changed their mind. Having said that, I think Trump is still in his honeymoon period. Take Gaza, for instance. Even though only 13% of people think that Trump's Gaza plan is a good idea, that's in the CBS poll with 53% approval, by the way. 13% thought it was a good idea. A whopping 54% of people approve of his handling of the Gaza conflict.
Right.
So that just tells me that they like Trump at the moment.
Sure.
And so they're not holding that against him, right? But I did want to draw your attention to a bit of an iceberg that's floating in the polling seas.
Nice metaphor.
I don't know, maybe. 66% of people say the Trump administration is not focusing enough on the lowering the prices of goods and services, which, of course, that was one of the key issues in the 2024 election campaign. So you want to pay attention to that. Furthermore, 51% said Trump's policies will make the prices they pay for food and groceries go up. And especially in the case of tariffs, 73% said those tariffs would generally make the prices of things go up. So Trump's losing the PR war on that particular issue. And this could be a problem for Trump, not only because tariffs are maybe about to start, but also because 47% of people say even before the tariffs, prices over the last few weeks have been going up already. And they're right about that. Consumer prices rose 0.5% last month, the highest rate for 18 months, creating an annual inflation rate of 3% for the first time in quite a few months. Egg prices in particular have been driving that increase in prices. They're up 15% for the last month to over $1 an egg now. That's the biggest monthly increase since 2015. And grocery prices generally have risen faster this month than any time in the last 2 years. Although, once again, 2/3 of that price rise is because of the effect of bird flu on egg prices. And this might be the reason why consumer sentiment has fallen 5% in 1 month. That's a lot. And it's the lowest reading for 6 months. It might be why also expectations of inflation have jumped to 4.3%, the highest reading since November 2023. So, yeah, John, this could develop as an issue. Right now, it's still probably Biden's economy up to now. But if prices keep going up and if Trump goes nuts with tariffs and prices keep rising, this could become a problem. And I think Trump knows that because he's taken to tweeting out things like, Biden inflation up! And look, right now you can probably get away with that. Sure, he's only been in office for 3 weeks, but that's going to wear thin really fast and there's no sign of those prices going down.
Yeah, that honeymoon may last 6 months. Barack Obama learned in 2010 that you can do great things like the Affordable Care Act, but if unemployment is still high and wages are still low and people are still feeling the effects of the global financial crisis, you don't get a lot of credit for the positive things you get done. Trump is getting a lot of things done that a lot of people like right now. $1 eggs, that's a problem. It's It's a big problem, and maybe another pandemic on the way, just quietly. But that's it for another edition of Planet America. We'll be back on ABC TV on Wednesday night at 9:40, or anytime you like from 9 on iView, YouTube and Facebook.
And we'll be back again on ABC News next Friday night from 8 p.m. Eastern Summer Time.
Bye-bye.